Dumelang, welcome to Face the Nation. My name is Clement Manyatela. Great to have you with us here on SABC News. On the show tonight, what implications does yesterday's budget postponement have for the DA-ANC relations within the GNU moving forward? Is this unprecedented moment a reality check for the ANC? Because for the first time ever, the organization is faced with the reality that it's no longer in charge on its own. And what options does this GNU government look at to get additional revenue in this financial year? Political economist Moeletsi Mbeki joins us tonight. Also on the show, what is government planning to tell President Donald Trump's administration to avoid losing AGOA? And is that administration even willing to listen? What does this mean for the trade relations between the two countries? The US is South Africa's second biggest trading partner. So what consequences await us should that policy be revoked or not renewed? The Minister of Trade and Industry, Park Stau, speaks to us. But first, my comment. All right, let's reflect for a bit on the unprecedented moment that happened in Parliament yesterday, the budget postponement. What do you think this moment means for the future of the GNU? I think this is the moment of reckoning for the ANC. For the first time ever, the party has come face to face with the reality that they're no longer in charge. The ANC had its way with cabinet positions. Remember when the DA wasn't happy about the positions they got? The ANC had its way. The Bella Act, that's another thing through which the ANC had its way. They had its way through the NHI as well with the Expropriation Act, even though the DA was opposing these. And this time around, the ANC is forced to the negotiating table, just like any other party and as equal partners. And that is a big wake-up call. Take a listen to what the DA leader John Steenhuisen said after the budget was postponed yesterday.
And what we have been doing is looking at how we can reduce the cost of government to make it lower. So, for instance, I've refused to take new cars. I'm driving ministers' cars from 2 ministers ago that have got over 200,000 kilometers on the clock. I know it's not good enough for Mr. Trollop and Action SA, but nonetheless, I think it's a commitment that we're not going to waste money on new cars. We'll use what we've got and try and make do with that. So whilst the cabinet may be larger, we have to look at innovative ways to be able to shrink that and make it smaller.
The minister in the presidency said it wasn't just the DA, though, that was against the VAT increase, prompting cabinet to postpone this budget.
I think all of you followed Minister Mackenzie when he was replying in Parliament. And in his reply, I think he succinctly clarified it was neither a DA issue, an ANC issue, a PA issue, or a DA versus ANC, or a PA versus ANC, or IFP versus ANC. It was a cabinet decision.
So the minister is arguing that it wasn't just the DA that was against this 2 percentage point increase. She says some ANC ministers were also against it. Sure, but even if that was just the DA in the GNU that was against it, we would still be here because the ANC needs the DA to pass this in Parliament. This is not about cabinet majority, it's about parliamentary majority. And in a case where the EFF, the MK, will be against the budget, well, trust that you need the DA in this context. I think it's become clear that National Treasury thought it will get the buy-in of all the parties on the same day that the budget was being presented, even though parties in the GNU, including the DA, have been saying no to the VAT increase during consultations. So it was a clear miscalculated risk, and as a result, a fruitless and wasteful expenditure. Briefing the media after his address at the G20 foreign ministers meeting, President Cyril Ramaphosa admitted that no one party in the GNU can be able to impose anything without much negotiation and discussion. He's confident that the parties will find one another. Now, having said all that, it's all good and well to reject or postpone, celebrate the postponement of the budget because We don't want this 2 percentage point increase on VAT from 15% to 17%. But what are the options? And that's a reality that faces us. That doesn't change the reality facing us, this postponement. There still is no money. Government needs additional revenue for its expenditure, an additional 60 billion rand or so for this financial year. Here's the Finance Minister, Enoch Kotongwana, explaining this conundrum.
What we're grappling with, given the challenges and priorities that we're facing, how do we fund them? Really, that's the debate. Do we borrow more? What are the implications of that? Do we continue cutting expenditure? What are the implications of that? Do we raise tax? What are the implications of that? There's general agreement that in the current environment, we need to find a way of funding our priorities. The debate is what is the best way of doing it?
And I don't know if there's the best way of doing it. Every single option you consider will have consequences. Do you cut spending? If you do, what about teachers in KwaZulu-Natal and other parts of the country? Remember, the budget cuts are forcing provincial departments to let go of some teachers. Or what about the doctors that have been marching, demanding to be employed? How do they get impacted by this if you cut spending? The other option that was considered is, of course, to drop the 350 social relief grant, the SRD grant, to save about 40 billion rand. But is that a viable option, seeing how it's been valuable for the most vulnerable in our society? Does our government increase the money that it's borrowing? Our debt levels are already unsustainable. What about corporate tax? If you increase corporate tax, that will affect businesses who have already been impacted by the energy unreliability in this country and other factors. So you don't want to overburden businesses until they close shop. I mean, some businesses react by closing shop, and then that affects our levels of unemployment. So even with this VAT increase, you can zero rate some goods, but that list doesn't go far enough, and you still don't have control over the price of the goods. So the sellers themselves can increase the price. So sometimes that cut doesn't really trickle down. So to cushion the poorest of the poor, government was planning to even increase social grants above inflation. They plan to adjust personal income tax and freeze the fuel levy. But was this going to be enough? So where do we get the 60 billion rand in additional revenue that we need for this year? And some people will argue, yeah, let's cut cabinet posts. Let's stop corruption. Let's stop the wasteful expenditure. And that's all good and well. But are those not long-term solutions? Because right now we need short-term solutions. All this is not going to happen in a year. It requires serious internal reforms. And that's why there's an argument that we don't have a revenue challenge. We have a spending challenge. So we do have the money. We're just spending it badly. So the question we're asking you tonight is, what would you advise the finance minister to do to get this much needed additional revenue? If you're against the VAT increase, what option do you think is better and viable? And the other question is, what do you think this unprecedented moment means for the African National Congress and the Democratic Alliance and their working relationship going forward? You can share your thoughts with us by sending us a WhatsApp voice note on 078-459-1897. Remember to tell us your name and surname and where you're sending that voice note from. Please keep it at 30 seconds. Alternatively, you can send us an X on @FaceTheNation SABC. After the break, we'll have this conversation with Moeletsi Mbeki. Stay with us. Welcome back. So let's reflect on some of your responses to the question we've been asking you tonight about the implications you think that the budget postponement has for the DA-ANC relations within the GNU moving forward. Some tweets that have come through. Michael says, I believe, Clement, that the delay is beneficiary to the relationship of the GNU, especially where it relates to the VAT, because no South African citizen can afford any increment of VAT in this vulnerable economy. Dennis says the budget postponement has highlighted the challenges facing the GNU and raised concerns about the country's economic and political stability. Secondly, it also questions the ability of the GNU to govern effectively and make key decisions. Morales says, in my view, the relationship between the two parties must be strengthened by this episode. The ANC lost its majority in the 2024 NP. It's obligated to consult fully with the GNU partners to seek consensus. What's needed is magnanimity, not arrogance. Utsu says what this means is that the government simply has no plan to grow the economy in the next 5 years. Tabiso says, I think the budget postponement may exacerbate existing tensions between the DA and ANC, creating a more competitive political environment within the GNU, and it might be seen as a sign of instability in the GNU, and major opposition parties could frame this delay as ANC incompetence. Thank you so much for your tweets. We'll play some of your WhatsApp voice notes also before we wrap up the show. Now, let's pick up from that conversation on what happened yesterday with the budget postponement due to a disagreement within the Government of National Unity. It is now expected to be presented on the 12th of March. For the first time, the ANC needs support from other parties to pass the budget as it lost its parliamentary majority in last year's elections. The Democratic Alliance, the ANC's main partner in this GNU, cited its opposition to the proposed 2-point increase in value-added tax as the reasons for the postponement. Political economist Moeletsi Mbeki joins us now to make sense of all of this in studio with us. Mr. Mbeki, thank you so much for making time. Good evening.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with just the budget under this GNU, because it's the first one, right? The first budget under the GNU. In any coalition, there will always be disagreements. Were you surprised by how things turned out yesterday?
Very surprised. I was sitting at my office, had my little notebook, and I was waiting to listen to the Minister of Finance, who always has something to say. And then it never happened. So that was a very big surprise.
Yeah.
I don't think there are many countries where, certainly in the tradition of South Africa and England and so on, where a Minister of Finance announces when it's announced that a Minister of Finance is not going to give his budget.
Yeah.
That's almost unique.
And it really, I think they do admit it was a miscalculated risk, because the Minister of Finance probably thought, I get into a cabinet meeting, I present what I plan to present in Parliament, and everybody just says, kudos, go ahead. But it wasn't to be, and the main issue here is the issue of a 2 percentage point on VAT. And I indicated earlier that at the end of the day, government doesn't have enough money now, and we can talk about whether or not they've got money, they're spending it wrong, but they need this additional 60 billion rand. So where do they get it? What options do you think are available for government?
Well, one of the options government has, we have the most expensive public service in the world as a percentage of GDP, of gross domestic product of South Africa. There was a report produced a couple of years ago, looking at the wage bill of the South African government. It was produced by the International Monetary Fund. Even they were shocked. The South African public service consumes 16% of gross domestic product as pay to the public service. Similar countries to South Africa, like Thailand, Indonesia, Chile, in South America, it's only 6%. So we have a hugely paid public service, which frankly, the question about its efficiency, the jury is out on that. But we have a hugely overpaid public service, which is a mega cost to the economy. The government can go there and reduce the cost of the public service. That would be where they should go.
The unions always say, Mr. Mbeki, that that's not really the issue according to them, because we always see, for instance, nurses are always protesting and saying, we're looking for jobs. Government often complains and says we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough nurses. So if the wage bill is bloated like that because there's supposedly so many people who are in the state and paid by the state, then why does government often complain about the lack of people in specific sectors.
No, but it's because the government officials themselves are part of this overpaid army of public servants. When you walk into Parliament as a backbencher, you earn, just walking through the threshold, you earn R1 million a year without doing anything. You can just go there, go into Parliament, go into your seat, fall asleep, you earn R1 million. So we have this hugely overpaid, the President of South Africa earns more money than the Chancellor of Germany. Germany has an economy many times the size of South Africa. But so we have a hugely inflated, in terms of pay, of the public sector. And I'm not talking about nurses or policemen. I'm talking about the top leadership in government, in the cabinet, in the directors general, deputy directors general, the whole administrative managerial class in the public sector. That's where you have to cut. And if you cut 5% of their salary of that class at the top end, including the cabinet, you would get your 60 billion in no time.
I mean, some will argue you'll probably get about 400 million or so. It's not going to push you to 60 billion rand.
10% of South Africa's GDP, if we cut off from, in order to be like similar countries, South Africa's GDP is about, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 7 trillion rands. 10% of 7 trillion is 700 billion rands. That's what you would get if you reduce, you paid our public sector the same salary as similar countries to us. It's a lot of money.
So, and of course, in other countries, you've got, for instance, public infrastructure that is functional. I mean, when you go to Europe, you can get on trains and you pay almost nothing to move from one point to another. I suppose what also adds to the need for better salary adjustments in this country is that option doesn't exist. People are spending, some people, over 50% of their salaries on transportation.
But that's the working class. They are not the people who I'm talking about.
So right at the top. That's where we need to cut.
I'm talking about the top end of the public sector. They don't ride trains. They don't even ride cars made in South Africa. They ride fully imported cars, the blue light brigade, so-called.
Yeah.
They don't even buy cars that are made in South Africa.
You've said this before, and I don't think government has this political appetite for government to do that. The president himself promised that I'll cut cabinet members. Has he done that? In fact, it's more inflated now with this GNU. So I don't think there's appetite to do that. So then where does that leave us?
Well, it leaves the ANC where it is now, with an egg on its face. It was overruled by the DA about presenting its budget. So it is now, the game is practically over for the ANC because it now is no longer a ruling party in South Africa. And that's what happened, just because they don't want to implement these painful reforms that have to be implemented in the economy.
Do you think this is an opportunity for the DA to push the ANC to implement those reforms? Because if you look at how the government of national unity has unfolded over the last couple of months after elections, the ANC has had its way almost on everything, right? On the Bella Act, on the NHI, on expropriation, you go on and on, even when the DA was opposing. But now, the DA seems to find its voice where it matters. Do you think this is where it can push the ANC to implement those very reforms you speak of that the ANC has been refusing or not interested to look at?
Well, the leader of the DA yesterday mentioned, and I was pleasantly surprised, he mentioned the cost of the public sector bills, wage bill. He said something has to be done about it. So they now, because where is the finance minister going to get the money that he won't get since he can't implement the VAT? Where is he going to get the money from? He will either cut the services that he's providing to the people, or he has to deal with this hugely inflated public sector wage bill.
That will be interesting, because if the ANC agrees to that, then you are at odds with the unions, and then becomes another fight. Were you surprised, though, that the ANC, as a progressive and pro-poor, and I'll do that in inverted commas, were you surprised that they're actually considering this 2 percentage point increase, given how vulnerable our economy is and how overburdened already South Africans are?
The ANC was pro-poor. It is no longer pro-poor. It's pro-middle class. That's why we have those huge salaries that are being paid to the middle class in the public sector. It's no longer pro-poor. That's why it can casually impose a huge cost on the poor. Because remember, who has taken the ANC from being a majority party to being a minority party? It's the poor who have abandoned it, who have stopped voting for it. So the ANC doesn't see the poor as its constituency anymore, because they feel the poor, especially the African and colored poor, they don't see them as their constituency because they are no longer voting for them.
Isn't where the ANC support has been vulnerable in the suburbs, like in the middle class? I would have imagined on the ground, in the far-flung areas, in the rural areas, that's where they still maintain some significant support.
Yes, they have support in the ANC has support in the rural area. But it is losing support in the very most important part of our society, which are the African working class in the metros. That's where the majority of the population of South Africa is. And that's where it is losing. Why is it losing support? Because it's allowing the economy to deindustrialize. So for the working class in the metros, they see unemployment rising. They see the economy stagnating. They don't see a future for their children. They see us importing more and more of what used to be made in South Africa. So it's their jobs that are now being thrown overboard, that are being sacrificed. And that's who is stopping to vote for the ANC. And the ANC, that's why the ANC can impose extra VAT on them, because they're saying these guys are no longer voting for us. Why should we look after them? Let's tax them to make up the difference that we want.
Why do you think they're not considering corporate tax? And of course, the finance minister will give reasons around the fear that once you target corporate tax, companies also somehow respond. That's going to have an impact on our high levels of unemployment, because some are going to shut down, some are going to cut off on some employees. Was that a viable option for the ANC as well?
Well, the finance minister explained yesterday that it's not a viable option because it depends on the profitability of the companies. If companies are not making a profit, then you can't tax a profit that doesn't exist. So he was saying that's not a reliable tax. That's why he goes for a consumption tax, because we all have to consume. We have to consume something, we have to consume bread, we have to buy petrol and so on. So he goes for those which you can't remove from your budget. Then he is. But for the poor people, they are the ones where consumption is a much higher part of their budget than for the middle class. So that's who gets hit the most by VAT.
What do you think this moment means for the African National Congress? I said earlier during my comment that it's almost like a reality check for them, because you almost feel like over the last couple of months they still believed that they're still in charge and they are the majority. I mean, you see it in how sometimes they just push on things without consultation, even in the GNU. What do you think what happened yesterday means for them? Do you think they are waking up to the reality that we're not in charge? We're actually here to co-govern. with other parties that we need and that we need to talk to like equal partners?
Well, I think the ANC, at least the leadership, they knew they couldn't elect the president, the deputy president, and the speaker of the National Assembly without the DA vote. So they knew they couldn't govern on their own. Mm-hmm. But they thought they could outmaneuver the DA, which to some extent they did outmaneuver it. But you know, you can only achieve so much through outmaneuvering, because then the guy you are outmaneuvering gets smart, but from your own tricks, he learns your own tricks. And that's what has happened with the ANC, is that the DA has learned the ANC's tricks, so now you have checkmate between the two of them. And the ANC has got a hugely embarrassing situation where this is a big international story where it cannot give its own budget.
Well, the president said, you know, the GNU is not really fragile. Don't see this as a crisis. This is a sign of a maturing democracy. Like in any other coalition, there will be disagreements, and he says this is one of those, and we'll get over it.
No, I'm sure. I don't see it as a threat to the GNU. I see it as telling the country a lot of messages about the ANC. It's not a threat to the GNU. The fact that they were vetoed is not that they have to learn to live with it. They have to negotiate. But what it is telling us is that the ANC now sees the low-income sections of our population as a target to milk. They are no longer interested in protecting that part of the community. They are now going to milk that part of our society to pay for this hugely inflated state, which really benefits the middle class more than anyone else.
And yet they don't touch on what benefits them as I mean, you look at the ministerial handbook and the benefits that are afforded to ministers. They're not even touching that. And I wonder how, and to your point, how does that read to the poorest of the poor who are going to be affected by VAT? And I mean, let's be honest, how are the ministers going to be affected by the VAT increase? Do they even buy their own groceries? When we pay for their housing, we pay for their transportation, we pay for their petrol. So do they really feel the effect of these taxes they want to impose?
Well, I think the message which is gradually sinking in is that the old alliance of the elite, the black elite, the middle class, the Africans, the colors, the Indians, and so on, to fight against apartheid, that has collapsed. What we are now seeing collapsing further is the African component of this alliance. The middle class are looking after themselves through the agency of the ANC. They are allowing our industrial infrastructure, our logistics infrastructure to collapse, because if you are going to look after the railways and maintain the railways, it means that you have to reduce the income of this middle class that is employed by the state. So they would rather pay these high salaries to the top end of the guys who run the railways rather than maintain the railways. But that has huge impact on the levels of employment for the ordinary working class, for the ordinary black working class in South Africa. But there is a parting of ways. I think this is what yesterday is telling us. There's a parting of ways between that big coalition that developed in the 50s, in the 60s, 70s, 80s of the African working class and the African middle class to fight against apartheid. Now it's everyone for themselves. So the middle class are using their political power to look after their economic interests, and they're saying, sorry to you guys, you have to fend for yourself.
Yeah, and just lastly, you said this was checkmate yesterday between the ANC and the DA. What do you think this moment means for the DA? Because it looks like for now they seem to have won the so-called PR war, so to speak, using this as leverage. And I wonder to what extent they're going to use this moment to also negotiate other things in the GNU, so that it's not just about, yes, we agree or not, but they try and say, also take into consideration what else we've been shouting at you about, but you've been ignoring. What do you think this moment means for the Democratic line?
I think they feel very emboldened. I'm sure they were terrified of vetoing the ANC's budget, but they did it, and the heavens didn't fall in, so they'll do it again next time with something else. So I think the DA feels very emboldened, and they will veto something else next time. Of course, we don't want instability in the South African government. We have a lot more problems than, Bella, the Bella bill and so on. So we don't want conflict in our body politics. And that's what the DA has to be aware of, that it may be angry with the ANC about one thing or the other, but the stability, the political stability of the country overrides almost everything else. Because we saw in July 2021 what happens when you trigger instability in the country. Hundreds of people get killed overnight, literally. So we don't want political instability. So the kind of trials of strength between the DA and the ANC in the government of national unity has to have a limit, that the limit is not triggering instability.
They must know when to do it.
They have to know when to stop. They have to know when to stop.
Moeletsi Mbeki, political economist, thank you so much for making time for us. Thank you for helping us make sense of what happened yesterday. Now, the question we've been asking you tonight is what you would advise the finance minister to do to get this much needed additional revenue, if you are against the VAT increase, of course. And we've been asking you what happened yesterday and what you think it means for the relationship between the ANC and the DA. More of your responses on Twitter. Makosonke says, budget postponed. Well, at this rate, the only thing that the GNU will successfully pass is blame, each one scoring political points. Anga says they are in bad shape and they have a potential to lower investment confidence. We need to find creative ways to expand our revenue base than opting for tax increases. Functional SOEs, productive sector investment, and SMMEs funding are some of the focus areas that should be considered. Mark says nothing. That tax can't break the GNU. If language, the Bella Act, land expropriation, and NHI couldn't. Nationalist parties left GNU in 1996 over serious policy differences of land, unions, death penalty, and abortion. Lungisi says yesterday's budget postponement was a clear indication that this so-called GNU is collapsing. Jerry says things are not looking good within the GNU, but politicians always pretend. Believe me, with international pressure from Trump, early elections is possible if the marriage doesn't work. Thank you so much for your tweets. Let's also wrap up with some of your WhatsApp voice notes that have come through responding to this unprecedented moment we witnessed yesterday in Parliament. Let's take a listen.
Good day, Clement. This is Tula in Northwest. I think the first thing that the government must do is to cut the cabinet ministers. Yes, it sounds long term, but if they can cut now, in 3 months' time, they'll be knowing that at least 1-2 million is saved. Number two, they should cut tender system. The tender system is taking too much from the government. I thank you.
Good evening, Clement. Yes, I think it's a good idea that the government increases tax. We cannot deny that our country is growing. The number of people, the population is growing in a huge number every day. So no matter how much we can try to cut spending and whatever, then we need money. like the tax increase.
Thank you so much for your voice notes. After the break, we'll have a conversation with the Minister of Trade and Industry, Pax Dau. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, President Donald Trump's decision to cut aid to South Africa in reaction to land reform policies that he claims will negatively impact the white minority has sparked concerns that the AGOA deal with the U.S. may be in jeopardy. Under the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, South Africa benefits from tariff-free quotas on agricultural exports, which include wine, citrus fruits, soybeans, sugarcane, and beef. So is the trade deal in jeopardy, and what is government planning to do to try and save it? Minister of Trade and Industry and Competition, Pax Dau, who joins us now in studio. Minister, thank you for making time. Good evening.
Thank you very much and good evening.
When is the SA delegation leaving to the U.S. to try and reason with President Donald Trump's administration and hopefully find each other?
Well, a date has not been set yet for a number of reasons. Of course, the U.S. administration is still under construction. Many of the senior executives, including the trade representative in the U.S., would be my counterpart in relation to trade, has not been appointed. So we thought that we should allow the administration to settle, the new congressmen and women to settle, so that we're able to go and engage with them objectively. Of course, the recent events have suggested that we need to speed up our engagements with the U.S., and the president announced that he would be sending a delegation to the U.S., but to also other trading partners throughout the world. But we're now working on the logistics of what would be the appropriate date.
Yeah, and I suppose what frustrates this process is that you are not the only delegation in South Africa speaking to Donald Trump's advisors or officials. I mean, you've got AfriForum, you've got the Democratic Alliance, who've all said, okay, we're also going to have our people go and reason there. And I wonder if that doesn't frustrate things, in that, are we speaking from one voice? Are we sending the same message to these officials in the U.S.?
Well, you'd have to accept that there are people that went to the U.S. and have continued to go to the U.S. and said, we are under siege. You know, our land is being taken forcefully. There is all sorts of land grabs happening in the country. We persecuted as a people in the country, which in reality is not true, but they've sent that message and consistently lobbied that message. So when the message arrives that South Africans are actually persecuting a people, you can't be surprised, because in reality, there are people that won't speak the voice that we're talking in South Africa that says, we're building a nation, we need to address the historic injustices in this nation, but as part of that process, we need to put in place processes of redress. So they see it as persecution, or at least they represent it as persecution. So certainly those people will continue to go. But my sense is that there is a collective view by rational South Africans, both at a political level, but also in business, in civil society, that have said, we want to be part of the South African delegation that talks about what's happening in South Africa. Yes, as a nation, we have challenges. All nations in the world have their challenges. But in reality, the story that you presented with is not a true picture of what's happening in South Africa.
So the biggest concern right now is around AGOA. I'm sure you've seen, because we received there were four U.S. congressmen now that have asked President Donald Trump to revoke South Africa's access to the U.S. markets through AGOA, because they say that the country is undermining American interests globally. So AGOA is more at risk now than ever before. Do you agree?
No, I mean, remember, we went to the U.S. last year. We went twice. There were already people in Congress that raised motions for South Africa to be reviewed. When AGOA was extended for a year, South Africa was included.
That's before Donald Trump was elected.
But certainly we're talking about having engaged with Congress. We engaged both with the administration and with Congress on a bipartisan basis. So we engaged with the Republicans and the Democrats. We engaged on a bicameral basis. We went to the Senate, we went to the House of Representatives, we went to different platforms, including the administration. We have to do that again. That's all I'm saying. But last year, you were in the same situation. It was it was not as pronounced as this, but we all knew as South Africans that there were different senators that made different motions about South Africa, and we went and argued our case.
And I guess my point is, to your point, it wasn't as pronounced as this. It's more pronounced now. There's more hostility coming from the head of state in the US. That's why I'm saying we are more at risk now than we were last year.
And we should also guard against thinking that this is a South African unique problem. We all accept that many countries in the world have got to go to the US to engage on a whole range of issues. Canada has had to go to the US, Mexico has had to go to the US. There are issues in relation to the Panama Canal that they have to go to the US. Europe has gone to the US. Different people are going to the US because the current US administration have raised issues in a particular way and they've engaged with the US. So there's also the sense that we're almost unique in this environment, and truth is we're not unique. We're part of nations that are responding to a US administration that has issued a number of executive orders that have implications for trade. They have implications for the World Trade Organization and for global trading environments. And we need to engage with the US, amongst others, to be part of a group of nations and the world that goes and says, we need to maintain the multilateral World Trading Organization system. It's important for global trade that we do that. We're not the only ones that would be saying so. We're part of a whole set of nations that have gone to the US to say, let us ensure that the World Trading Organization functions. You know, when the World Trade Organization functions, we have predictability in the trade environment. Some of the pronouncements that have been made are outside the frameworks as agreed to in the multilateral platforms, and we need to go and engage with them and say it is in everybody's interest that we maintain a world trading system. In the context of South Africa, there are specific issues that would be raising. Amongst others, it would be about AGOA. We certainly trade under AGOA. We trade under 3 different regimes, trading regimes with AGOA, with the US rather. AGOA constitutes about 23.5% of that. The general system of preferences, the GSP, which is being overtaken now because it ran out, gives us about 2.4% of trade. And the balance happens under the World Trade Organization Most Favored Nations platform.
What would be the consequences if this policy is revoked or it's not renewed? What would be the consequences for us, but also for the US as well?
Well, in many ways, you have to think about it this way. Who trades with the US in terms of enterprises? The bulk of our trade is actually in the automotive sector in terms of manufactured goods. We send a lot of vehicles into the US because we've built automotive manufacturing capacity. That would be impacted. Of course, it doesn't mean that it can't trade under the Most Favored Nations platform, because we still have a platform that's called Most Favored Nations that is the bulk of trade that we do with the US, so it would convert into Most Favored Nations as a platform of trade with the United States of America. So AGOA, to the extent that it is an agreement it's outside, it certainly is a decision by the US to say we're giving these countries concessions, but it doesn't mean that the US has withdrawn everything that happens in relation to trade and the preferential trade arrangements that happen with the US. The majority, by far, of those happen under Most Favored Nations, and we'll continue to trade under that platform. So in reality, I don't think we should discount the impact of AGOA, but we should also take into account that we still would be able to trade with the US, but of course we'd still want to engage with them around how do we resolve AGOA, because in fact South Africa is the highest user of AGOA on the African continent. But it's also a platform from which our neighboring countries are also able to participate in value chains. So if you think about a vehicle that goes to the US, the harnesses could have come from Botswana. Other components could have come from other parts of the continent that constitute part of that vehicle. So when you actually talk about South Africa and you say, well, we would want to exclude South Africa, including a whole range of other nations that are part of that. But also, the American companies that are located in South Africa, they trade under AGOA, and they send products under AGOA. They are located in South Africa, but they are able to take advantage of that.
Yeah.
So there are all sorts of implications that we need to work through and say, well, is this ideal? It's mutually beneficial in many ways if you think about the American enterprises that are located in South Africa that trade on the basis of what they manufacture here into the US.
Is the South African government prepared to move even an inch from its localization policies? Because how much of the tension with the US is actually about Elon Musk's efforts to launch Starlink in South Africa? I mean, there are regulatory requirements for 30% local ownership, a policy aimed at redressing racial inequalities. He has been questioning that policy.
I think it would be presumptuous to say that the US government makes decisions on the basis of Elon Musk. I'm not suggesting it's not influential, but I think it would be presumptuous. We would have to go there and they would have to say so to us. But in reality, if you're talking about Starlink in particular, and in our engagement with Starlink, they said, look, as a multinational company, we don't allow for local shareholding. But that happens with a whole range of other companies that invest, and they are doing it in different parts of the world. You just function within the regime of that country that says, okay, in South Africa we say we provide for equity equivalence. That's the option that's being considered, and Minister of Communications has said, can we consider this? The challenge, of course, is that if you go back to our own regime as a country and what governs broad-based black economic empowerment, particularly in the communications sector, they haven't made provision for equity equivalence.
Yeah.
So in that context, then, it has to go back to the council that deals with it. It's the way in which we function in South Africa.
But you see, there's motive here for Elon Musk.
Multinationals come to the country, they trade with the country.
Well, he doesn't want to be subjected to that.
They trade with the country. Everybody that trades throughout the world works on the basis of how I engage with this country, what are the rules of the game in this country. You can't suggest to me that, in fact, Starlink has invested in other parts of the world and it hasn't been governed by the rules of that country.
Of that country, yeah. But then,
so South Africa also has rules.
He probably feels like he can bully us. I mean, they've walked away from the negotiations now because they just don't think that their, as you said, their company can go into local shareholding. That's why I'm asking, as the South African government, are you prepared to even negotiate that, or are you clear and firm in that these are our country's policies? If you want to come operate a business here, take it or leave it.
Well, firstly, let me say that the day a country makes a decision to undermine its own laws, then everything else doesn't work. Because if you make the concession for one company, then it shouldn't apply to anybody else. So you have to say, how do we make it work? My sense is that, and there are different people that are talking to investors, including Elon Musk, about what are the opportunities to invest in the country, how to facilitate that. We had a discussion, the president had a discussion with Elon Musk and said, this is what, and he said, this is what I'd want to do. I've had engagements with his people, subsequent to the engagements with the president, and no, the relationship is not hostile. We're not talking in a hostile environment where they say,
well, his tweets are saying something completely different.
We still talk. I don't respond on Twitter. I generally
these are unprecedented times. The US president talks to us via Twitter, mentions and announces policies via Twitter, not through the diplomatic channels. So maybe our way of responding needs to change as well. Before we wrap up,
still send note verbals.
Yes, true. We've done that before and it seemed to work. Let's talk quickly about the transformation fund that you wanted to create as the department. My understanding is that you were looking at about, was it 100 billion rand that you wanted to fund and support black businesses? And my question is, will the firms be expected to contribute to the fund if they're already meeting their ESD or equity equivalence program targets based and under the code?
No, actually all we're saying is let's aggregate our efforts. There are all sorts of funding instruments that are there, equity equivalent, funding instruments, there's ESD funding, and we're saying no. But let's start from the beginning, just to go back a bit. Can we measure how far we have succeeded through the instruments that are in place? And the gap we've identified is that there are these many disparate initiatives that don't have the requisite impact. If we aggregate and consolidate our efforts, we can make a greater impact with regards to transformation. But it's also about ensuring that it contributes to industrialization and commercial development. In many ways, if you look at many of the enterprise and supply development participation programs, many of them do not participate in the actual industrial value chains. So we're saying, but can we change that? Can we ensure that this contributes towards ensuring reindustrialization as a country? We invest in something that's productive from an industrial development point of view. So all we're saying is the resources that we're all currently investing, whether it's the state, the private sector, through ESD, through equity equivalence, all these resources that are there, can we consolidate them, aggregate them, have a common governance mechanism, and then measure ourselves against output? So these are the things we want to do.
Have we worked on the modalities of this proposal? Are you still willing to talk to business and other stakeholders? Because they seem, some of them, to be opposing this.
Well, no, actually, I mean, we've spoken to business and said, the problem is that discussion was public before we started with the public engagement process. And I won't get to how a member of parliament essentially, to tell the truth, didn't present it the way in which the report says, to be as diplomatic as possible. Truth is, we have a document. We're now going to canvass that document to stakeholders, and business is an important, in fact, pivotal part of the stakeholders that we need to engage to say, this is the proposal. We've had businesses that have already expressed appetite and said, we actually want to participate. Because many businesses say, you know, in my line of business, I'm not involved in supplier development. Don't get me to run an engineering company and a financing company at the same time. We're an engineering company. We want to participate in enterprise.
And some other businesses said, how did you even get to 100 billion rand? And what are the protection measures? Because this money could be wasted.
It's wasted if, in fact, governance is inadequate. We've said we would want a governance mechanism where business is an integral part, and we measure the outputs. We set ourselves objectives, and we say, these are the objectives we need to achieve. Let me make an example. And let's look at trying to think of a sector, let's say the auto sector. And we say the auto sector, they manufacture a car. We've agreed that we'd want to get to 60% localization of what is in that car. And we've agreed with industry that's the objective. We're currently at less than 40%. To get us to that level, can we ensure that there are black enterprises and entrepreneurs that constitute part of your tier 1 and tier 2 enterprises and industrialists that participate? Is that a wrong thing to ask for? It can't be a wrong thing to ask for. All we're saying is we can measure. We've got the funds, we've got the objectives. We now need to build that capacity. We need the industrial capacity, the supplier development capacity to ensure that black people are able to participate across the value chain. Minister, it can't be wrong.
Yeah. Minister Pakstau, thank you so much for making time for us. Really appreciate it. And thanks to you for watching the Thursday edition of Face the Nation. We'll be back with you on Tuesday next week at 8 p.m. Have a good evening. Cheers.